December 13th, 1974. A cruise liner is sailing through the Philippine Sea in a storm after dark. On board, Soviet tourists are drinking, dancing, and celebrating the last night of their vacation. One passenger is not celebrating. He's walking toward the stern with a towel over his shoulder. Underneath it, a diving mask, a snorkel, and a pair of fins. He is about to jump from a moving ship, alone, into open ocean, at night, in a storm, with no boat, no radio, and only a rough idea of which direction land might be. This is not a survival scenario. This actually happened. This is Earth Survival Guide, and this is the true story of Stanislav Kurilov. Part 1. The Boy Who Was Banned from the Sea. Kurilov was born in 1936 in Vladikavkaz in the Soviet Union and grew up in Semipalatinsk, deep in the steppes of Kazakhstan, about as far from an ocean as a Soviet child could get. His parents forbade him from swimming in open water. So, naturally, he learned in secret. At age 10, he swam across the Irtysh River on a dare, and from that point on, the sea, a sea he'd never even seen, became the center of his imagination. He devoured adventure novels about sailors and castaways, the kind of books that make landlocked children fall in love with horizons they've never stood on. He wanted to join the Navy. His eyesight disqualified him. So he found the next closest path. He studied at the Leningrad Meteorological Institute and became an oceanographer, learning to scuba dive along the way. He also discovered yoga and meditation, decades before either was common in the Soviet Union, a discipline of breath control and mental endurance that, without anyone knowing it yet, was about to become the most important skill of his life. Kurilov built a career at the Institute of Oceanology and later the Marine Biology Institute in Vladivostok. He was good at his job. Good enough, in fact, that legendary French explorer Jacques Cousteau's team requested him personally for a joint underwater research project. Soviet authorities refused to issue him an exit visa. Twice. Instead, they sent a different team, with proper paperwork, but no diving experience. Cousteau's people refused to work with them at all. Kurilov's personal file carried a quiet, bureaucratic verdict, not worthy of an exit visa, not because of anything he'd done, partly because his sister had married a foreign national and moved abroad, which was enough in the Soviet system to make an entire family permanently suspect. He was a scientist who had dedicated his life to the ocean, and the state had decided he was never allowed to actually see most of it. In the Soviet Union of the 1970s, an exit visa wasn't a formality. It was a permission slip the government could deny for any reason, or no reason at all, and there was no appeal process that actually worked. For a man who lived for open water, that permission slip had just become the entire shape of his future. In 1974, Kurilov saw an advertisement for a cruise. From winter into summer. 20 days, departing Vladivostok, sailing south toward the equator on the liner Sovetski Soyuz, then returning without ever docking in a foreign port. No port calls meant no passport checks and no exit visa required. It was designed as a harmless novelty cruise for Soviet citizens who would never actually leave Soviet jurisdiction. Kurilov looked at the planned route and saw something else entirely. A one-way door, if he was willing to jump through it. He studied the ship's course. He calculated that it would pass through the Philippine Sea, within swimming range, a rough, dangerous, unconfirmed swimming range of Siargao Island in the Philippines. For most of the voyage, he played the role of an ordinary tourist, group activities during the day. But at night, while other passengers were drinking and dancing, he was on deck, quietly studying the stars, the ship's layout, and the water. He identified the only place he could realistically jump from without being seen, and without being pulled into the ship's propeller, the stern of the main deck. His estimate for the swim, based on the ship's course, was around 18 kilometers to shore. It was an estimate that would turn out to be badly, dangerously wrong. After sunset on December 13th, in stormy weather, with rough seas and low visibility, Stanislav Kurilov walked to the stern of the ship carrying nothing but a towel. Underneath it, a snorkeling mask, fins, and a breathing tube. No wetsuit, no food, no fresh water, no compass, no life vest. He put on the equipment and jumped from a moving ocean liner into a storm, at night, in open water, far from any shipping lane. For a few seconds after hitting the water, there was nothing to do but wait. Wait to see if he'd been seen. Wait to see if the current would pull him into the hull. Wait to find out if the plan he'd spent months building in silence was actually going to work at all. He wasn't seen by the crew. He wasn't struck by the propeller. Both were matters of pure luck, and both could have ended the story in the first 10 seconds. The ship's lights faded into the storm behind him. Ahead of him, darkness, open ocean, and a swim he had estimated, incorrectly, at 18 kilometers. Almost immediately, Kurilov realized his navigation was off. Currents were pulling him away from his intended line. The 18 kilometers he'd planned for kept stretching further and further towards something closer to 100. With no compass, he navigated the only way available to him, by the stars, tracking constellations across the night sky, correcting his heading hour after hour in total darkness, alone, in open water. He had no food and no fresh water for the entire swim. His body began breaking down almost immediately. Dehydration, muscle exhaustion, and a cold that never fully left him even in tropical water. This is where his yoga training stopped being a hobby and became a survival tool. Controlled breathing techniques let him regulate his heart rate, manage panic, and conserve energy his body no longer had to spare. He drifted in and out of a state somewhere between meditation and exhaustion, driven hallucination, forcing his mind to stay functional long after his body wanted to stop. Day turned to night, and night turned to day, and the horizon in every direction remained exactly the same. Water, with no land anywhere in sight. He later wrote about the ocean at night, the phosphorescent glow of disturbed water trailing off his own hands with every stroke, one of the only things resembling company for 3 days completely alone. There were sharks in these waters. He kept swimming anyway, because stopping wasn't a survivable option either. By the second day, exhaustion had become the primary threat, more immediate than any predator, more dangerous than the distance still ahead of him. Every stroke was now a negotiation between his body and his will. He rationed his own effort constantly: swim, float, breathe, recover, repeat. A rhythm that had to be sustainable for a distance he still didn't know the true length of. By the third day, sleep deprivation alone should have ended things. He had been awake, in open water, using his body continuo. Nearly 3 days after jumping from the stern of a Soviet cruise liner, Stanislav Kurilov reached the coast of Siargao Island in the Philippines, having swum roughly 100 kilometers, more than 5 times his original estimate, with no food, no water, and no rest. Local fishermen found him and brought him ashore. He could barely stand. He was, by any reasonable medical definition, still alive by a narrow margin. Word reached Philippine authorities within hours. A man had swum out of the Pacific, claiming to be a defector from a Soviet cruise ship. Naturally, they didn't immediately believe him. Kurilov was taken first to Cagayan de Oro, then to Manila, for questioning that stretched on for roughly 6 months. Philippine authorities suspected he might be a Soviet intelligence operative, a spy with an unusually elaborate cover story. It was the height of the Cold War. a man swimming out of a Soviet ship in the middle of the Pacific sounded less like a defection and more like the opening scene of an espionage plot, and the investigators treated it that way until the evidence finally convinced them otherwise. International media picked up the story almost immediately. A Soviet citizen had escaped the USSR by jumping off a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean and swimming for days to freedom. Back in the Soviet Union, Kurilov was tried in absentia, formally branded a traitor to the motherland, and sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp, a sentence he would never serve for a country he would never see again. Once cleared by Philippine authorities, Kurilov was permitted to travel to Canada, where he spent over a decade rebuilding a life, starting, in one of history's more understated ironies, with a job at a pizzeria, before eventually returning to oceanographic work as a diver for research firms, prospecting in equatorial waters and the Arctic. In 1986, he moved to Israel, married Lena Gendelev, and joined the Israel Oceanographic and Limnological Research Institute in Haifa, spending the rest of his career doing, professionally and legally, exactly what he had once nearly died trying to earn the right to do. On January 29, 1998, Kurilov was diving in the Sea of Galilee. His diving partner became entangled in submerged fishing nets on the lake bottom. Kurilov worked to free them. In doing so, he used up his own air supply. He didn't surface in time. The man who had swum roughly 100 kilometers across open ocean, past sharks, through a storm, on nothing but willpower and stolen breath, drowned in a lake at just past 60 years old, trying to save someone else. His widow later said that his years of training had taught him to master fear better than almost anyone, and that his instinct, right to the end, was to keep working the problem rather than panic. In the water, some people fight to survive. Kurilov, it seems, simply never stopped working. He spent 3 days proving that the will to survive could outswim an ocean. In the end, it was someone else's life he was trying to save when his ran out, which, for a man who once risked everything just for the freedom to be near the water, might be the only ending that actually fits. He was laid to rest in a small cemetery in Jerusalem, thousands of kilometers from the steppes of Kazakhstan, where a boy once dreamed of an ocean he'd never seen. This is Earth Survival Guide. If this story moved you, subscribe and join us for the next one, because sometimes the most extraordinary survival stories aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're real people who really did the impossible. Stay prepared, stay aware, survive.